We now have a debate on music in prisons. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chope, and I'm very pleased to have been able to secure this debate on music in prisons this afternoon. I'm sorry that the Prisons Minister is unable to attend, but he did do me the courtesy of speaking to me personally to apologise, and I know that he's briefed the Parliamentary Under-Secretary on the issues we're debating this afternoon. Now, I also know, Mr. Chope, that the Prisons Minister is well aware of the efficacy of using the arts, and specifically music, as a means for rehabilitation of prisoners. The National Offender Management Service, known as NOMS, their research into the arts in prisons, in fact, concluded, Mr. Chope, and I quote, that arts projects are effective at improving in-prison behaviour, such as compliance with rules and engagement with the regime, and individual psychological factors such as depression and a sense of purpose. In fact, in 2008, a study by Cambridge University stated, it's clear, and I quote again, it is clear that the Music in Prisons project contributes to the prison service's aim to provide safe, secure and decent regimes, and concluded that music projects play a role in fulfilling the reducing reoffending pathways. So I could go on citing more and more evidence on this issue, Mr. Chope, but I know that the Department and the Minister are well aware of it, and as the Prisons Minister said to me in an answer to the question I put to him on the floor of the House on the 18th of March, and I quote, he's right that music can be a method of rehabilitation. So I do know that the Prisons Minister accepts that that is the case. So given that well-established consensus, I was very surprised earlier this year to start receiving letters from prisoners who knew of my own interest in music, telling me that new rules on incentives and earned privileges meant that they were no longer going to be permitted to keep steel-strung guitars in their cells and were having to hand them in. One wrote to me, and I quote from his letter, "Have you ever visited a prison and seen the first-hand power that music has, in particular learning a musical instrument to change prisoners' attitudes and lives for the better?" In fact, I have, Mr. Chope, visited prisons in my former position as a government minister for skills and in education, and indeed seen the kind of power that these programs can have on rehabilitating offenders. And he went on to describe how the new restrictions were impacting on prisoners. Now, that was just one of the many representations I received, Mr. Chope, and so I raised the issue in the House with the Prisons Minister at Justice Questions, and his answer gave me some encouragement that he was prepared to look into this issue. So I was slightly disappointed. I won't put it any stronger than that at this time, Mr. Chope, but slightly disappointed when the follow-up letter that I received from him simply confirmed the policy and didn't offer any rationale whatsoever for it. And that's why I applied for today's debate, in order to pick at this thread a little bit more and find out what it's all about. Now, most people who hear about this assume that there must be some kind of security risk, which is at the source of the change in policy. But of course, nowhere in his answer to me in the House, or indeed in his letter to me subsequently, has the Prisons Minister made any such suggestion. It is true that a prisoner could potentially do harm with a guitar or with guitar strings, but that's equally true, Mr. Chope, of nylon guitar strings, the thicker ones, the bass strings of which are actually wound with steel in any case, as the Minister acknowledged in his letter to me. Of course, yes.
Can I first of all congratulate him on securing this debate? It is a very important issue, and I absolutely support the thrust of his argument. And Mr. Chope, I should make a declaration in relation to the book I published last year on prison reform, which is in the Register of Member Interests. Would you agree with me that yes, it is the case that we should be encouraging music in prisons to the greatest extent possible, but also that it is legitimate and a proper part of the prison rehabilitation process that the government, and to be fair, the previous government, were engaged in, that this should be part of an incentive programme?
Indeed, I do accept that proposition, absolutely. And I think I'll go on in my remarks, I think, to show that I don't think that that applies in this case, and that this particular restriction, I believe, for however it's happened, perhaps by accident, is I think, without any rationale. I might have added that I would offer to send a copy of his book to some prisoners so they could read it, but of course we're not allowed to do that anymore. But I've not been able to I've not been able to discover any rhyme or reason for a blanket ban on steel-strung guitars. In fact, looking at the NOMS incentive and earned privileges instruction, which I commend to the honourable member, which brought this policy into effect from last November, it very helpfully lists all of the restrictions on items approved for those prisoners on the standard and enhanced scheme, and places a convenient S next to them if an item is being restricted for security reasons. And of course there's no S placed next to the guitar string restriction, so the change is not to do with security. Now, why should this really matter? What difference does it make, Mr. Chope, whether prisoners are permitted nylon-strung or steel-strung guitars? I accept that this is not the most important issue in the world, or even with regard perhaps to prisons policy. But for a guitarist, there's an obvious difference between nylon-strung and steel-strung guitars. And that's not just to do with the sound they make or the style of music for which they're suited. It's even more crucially to do with the way that the strings are attached to the body of the guitar, which is completely different in each case. This means, in effect, that existing guitars that prisoners have bought out of their prison wages for use in their own cells can become redundant, and have done so in many cases. Prisoners wrote to me to explain that, and I quote from one of those letters where the prisoner said, "There are a lot of devastated guys who are having to hand back electric guitars and steel-strung acoustics. Many of them would have saved up over months or years from their £14.47 per week prison wages to buy their instruments." In fact, the vast majority of guitars in prisons, Mr. Chope, are steel-strung. The prisons minister said in his letter to me that the guitars donated by the Prison Guitar Doors Initiative, the organisation founded by the musician Billy Bragg, are mainly used in organised settings outside of the cell, and that is correct. But of course, to gain any benefit with a musical instrument, Mr. Chope, you need to be able to practice. And I would have thought that is the very definition of a purposeful activity, which is what the government, I think, is trying to achieve. I beg your pardon?
Would you give way?
I won't give way, because it is a conversation between myself and the Minister, and, but I do appreciate his interest, but I'd just like to use the time. Perhaps he can intervene on the Minister if there's time. Which the Minister rightly wants to incentivise that purposeful activity. And that means you need the same sort of guitar available in your cell as you're using in the lessons. So the Minister will have seen the letter, I assume, in today's Guardian, as I'm sure he's an avid reader of that newspaper, signed by an impressive array of musicians, starting with Billy Bragg, who's done tremendous work, I think we'd all agree, for many years, taking on, in a way, the mantle of the great Johnny Cash in helping to spread the message of the rehabilitative and redemptive power of music in our prisons. He was also supported in his letter by guitar legends like Johnny Marr, formerly of the Smiths, who I understand even the Prime Minister is a big fan of. People like Richard Hawley, formerly of Pulp, and in this year of the 60th anniversary of the Fender Stratocaster, Pink Floyd's Dave Gilmour, who owns the Stratocaster with the serial number 0001. Now, these are musicians who understand how music can transform lives, and they also understand, as they make clear in their letter, that an ill-thought-through, unnecessary restriction of this kind can have a serious effect in our prisons. And in their letter, they asked the Secretary of State to look urgently into the rise of self-inflicted deaths in our prisons and self-harm, and whether or not some of the new restrictions could be a contributory factor. Now, that's not as far-fetched as it may sound to some, Mr. Chope. Last year, researchers at St Andrews University found that playing a musical instrument, even at moderate levels of activity, can benefit brain functioning. Ines Jensch from the university's School of Psychology and Neuroscience said of the research, "Our findings could have important implications as the processes involved are among the first to be affected by aging, as well as a number of mental illnesses such as depression." Now, earlier today, Mr. Chope, I spoke to the fiancée of a prisoner who told me that the prisoners who play guitar in the prison where her fiancé is currently serving a sentence had been devastated and depressed by the decision because it in effect meant they had to hand their guitars back in. I want to be charitable to the minister and to the absent prisons minister because it's my sense that this was probably not the outcome that they intended. Not least because when I first raised this in the House, the prisons minister told me that he was unaware of the detail of this particular restriction. Now, I know there are many other parts of the new restrictions which are controversial, including the restriction I alluded to earlier on in relation to books, also clothing, which I'm sure ministers at some point are going to have to look at again and revisit. But for the purpose of today's debate on music, I would urge ministers to look again at this particular decision with a view to reinstating the permission for prisoners to have steel-strung guitars in their cells. We've already established that security is not a concern. It's not about security in the NOMS document in relation to this. It can't be about noise or nuisance, as steel-strung acoustic guitars and nylon-strung acoustic guitars make very similar levels of noise. If the concern is about electric guitars, then rather than ban them completely, restrictions could be placed on amplification, not least as it's perfectly possible to insist that such guitars are played through headphones. They can, in effect, be silent and not disturb anyone whatsoever, and that would be a very sensible restriction. One of the prisoners who wrote to me said, and I quote, "I'm not sure why this change in national policy has occurred, but as one prison officer put it, the prisoners who are learning a musical instrument are generally the most well behaved." So I understand that the minister deputising today for the prisons minister may not be in a position here and now today to reverse this policy, but I ask him to report back to the prisons minister on the discussion that we have this afternoon and to ask him if he will agree, and I have every reason to think that he will, that if he will agree to meet with me, and if we can synchronise diaries with the musician Billy Bragg as well, to meet myself and Billy Bragg to explore this further and discuss the possibility of changing the decision. I think the prisons minister is a reasonable man, and I think he's understood that neither myself, the prisoners themselves, Billy Bragg or the other musicians who've supported this campaign are arguing that prisoners do not lose many of the rights they would have on the outside when they commit a crime that leads to their imprisonment. But what we're all arguing is that a significant public investment is made in our prisons, and that most of the prisoners in them will eventually be released into the community and will be living amongst us in our communities. Music is a proven aid to rehabilitation, and restricting access to it for no good reason will in the end cause more problems than any as yet unknown reason for this unnecessary and counterproductive restriction. So I look forward to the minister's response, and as an optimist, I have every confidence that good sense will eventually prevail and prisoners will once again be able to play their guitars and prepare for a new beginning when they eventually get out of jail. Perhaps, Mr. Chope, by playing and singing, as I'm sure you're familiar with it, the old Bob Dylan song, any day now, I shall be released. Thank you.
Silas Vara.
Mr. Chope, can I just say first of all what a privilege it is to serve under your chairmanship again, and can I also thank the honourable gentleman for having secured this debate on this very important subject, and can I also say that it is abundantly clear from what he has said that he has great expertise and knowledge in this area, And can I, at the outset, give him an assurance that I will ensure that what he has said today is conveyed to my colleague, and also I'm more than happy to facilitate a meeting for him to the extent that it is felt necessary after I've said my piece. This is an important debate, and I very much welcome the opportunity to speak about the important role that music plays in our prisons and to set out the position regarding prisoner access to musical instruments. Let me be clear that facilitating access to musical instruments for prisoners is an important part of their rehabilitation. Whether that is individual prisoners learning to play musical instruments or music being played in a shared environment, such as in a prison chaplaincy, music can provide focus, encourage positive social interaction, and provide constructive activity. In a chaplaincy, we see activities involving and using music in a range of ways. As well as music used as part of some of the main acts of worship, a number of chaplaincies have choirs or chapel bands. These allow prisoners to be part of a creative shared experience, can help develop their listening and communication skills, and can also help in terms of them engaging with others in a positive way. In education, there is significant provision for learning about music. The Offenders Learning and Skills Service, which has been commissioned jointly by the National Offender Management Service and the Skills Funding Agency, works with offenders to identify their learning needs and advise on what learning and training opportunities are available at these prisons. Vocational opportunities are available towards the end of a prisoner's sentence so as to ensure that any training undertaken is current and relevant to the local job market on release. The Offenders Learning and Skills Service also funds personal and social development, which may include recreational learning, such as music activity. Personal and social development is particularly helpful when engaging with resistant learners who might not participate in more formal learning. In the 2011-12 academic year, there were 580 enrolments on OLAS courses, which involved music as part of the course title. There are a range of courses available, including Award for Music Practitioners, Award in Music Theory, and Award in Sound Engineering and Music Technology. Aside from learning, prisoners are also able to listen to music in their cells, whether that is through listening to CDs in their possession or listening to the radio. As well as the availability of national radio, prison radio is now installed in 102 prisons. Certainly.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. Having appeared on prison radio and having experienced its abilities and the quality of it in Brixton, where is one of the hubs for prison radio, can I first of all say it is doing a fantastic job and should be supported by the Ministry of Justice. And secondly, can I assure the House that my book, although unable, and quite rightly unable, to be posted randomly by any person, however esteemed, is available in prisons in the usual channels and is being read.
Thank you, Mr. Chope, and for those prisoners who are regular and avid readers of Hansard, I'm sure they will take note of that plug for my honourable friend's book and that it is easily available in the relevant prison libraries. And I note what he has to say about the prison radio service, which I know is available in many, many prisons. Mr. Chope, the Prison Radio Association delivers national prison radio and prison radio tutors. Tutors work with prisoners to develop new and innovative content, as well as output that is focused around reducing reoffending and encouraging engagement with education, training and opportunities in prison. Music is also broadcast. It is also the case that many individual prison governors engage with local community and voluntary sector organisations which facilitate music-based activities. So there is plenty of music to be heard in our prisons. I recognise, however, that the honourable member's concerns are particularly around changes we have made to the incentives and earned privileges policy framework and what these changes might mean for prisoners who want to play guitars. I think it is important that I explain the intention behind our changes and what they mean in practice. The policy on incentives and earned privileges went through a thorough and detailed review, the first such review for more than 10 years, to ensure that the revised framework would properly address reoffending and was something in which the public would have confidence. In reviewing the policy, extensive consultation was undertaken with prison operational staff. Since the changes came into effect on 1st November 2013, the absence of bad behaviour has no longer been enough to earn privileges. Now prisoners must also work towards their own rehabilitation and help others. This focus on rehabilitation resulted in a number of other changes to the framework. No longer, for example, can prisoners sit in their cells watching television when they should be out working or at education. No longer can they spend much of their days in the gym. An important part of our changes was ensuring that prisons operated to a consistent standard when allowing privileges to those prisoners who have earned them. That is why we introduced the Standardised Facilities List. The Standardised Facilities List identifies and limits the items of property that prisoners can retain in their cells, subject to their IEP level. The list is available for each governor to select from, as considered suitable for the specific population, the physical fabric, and the regime of the prison. The changes have not prevented prisoners from being able to play musical instruments. The greater commitment a prisoner shows to the requirements of the IEP framework, the more money they are able to earn from working, the greater the amount of money they are allowed to spend, and the greater the range of property they are allowed to have. Prisoners who work hard and engage and achieve standard and enhanced levels are allowed to purchase a musical instrument to keep in their possession at the governor's discretion. Prisoners who do not engage are not permitted to have a musical instrument in their actual possession. The Standardised Facilities List sets out a number of different instruments that prisoners can purchase. For example, a prisoner could have a flute, a harmonica, or an acoustic guitar. The Honourable Member is concerned in particular about the position in respect of prisoner access to guitars and the type of strings that are permitted. Prisoners on the standard and enhanced levels of the IEP framework can be allowed to have an acoustic guitar with nylon strings. For bass notes, this can include nylon strings with metal coiled around the outside. Guitar strings can be issued on a one-for-one basis, subject to risk assessments. It is the case that full metal guitar strings are not permitted. As I've already mentioned, the revised policy was subject to a significant level of consultation with the operational line and with other interested parties. This consultation extended to the contents of the standardised list itself. It was in the light of security concerns that a decision was made not to allow full metal strings. Certainly.
David Brennan.
I'm grateful for that piece of information because that is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that ministers have raised any security concern. And can he explain to me why, if that is the case, that there is a security concern, which incidentally I would hope to persuade him there need not be in relation to, with regard to nylon strings, but why, if that is the case, that is not indicated in the NOMS list of items and the restrictions thereupon, and why no security S is flagged on the document?
I'm not saying that there is no security risk with the nylon strings, because I think it is acknowledged that there is, but it is just felt that there is a greater risk with metal strings. As far as the specifics that the Honourable Gentleman requires, I'm mindful of the time limitations on this debate, and I'm keen that I should put on record as much as I can, but it is certainly something that I'm happy to return to later on. Certainly.
Before he does move on, and there are 6 minutes left, but before he does move on, can I say that, Mr. Chope, this is the heart of the matter, and no, it does not say in the NOMS document that there is a security concern. So I'd be grateful if he would, following the debate, perhaps send me the details of that concern and in what way that was raised during the consultation, and perhaps indicate why it isn't signalled in the NOMS document. But I am grateful also for his earlier offer of a meeting with the Minister to discuss this further.
Certainly. I'm happy, Mr. Chope, to following up from this debate, to supply the information that the Honourable member has requested, and indeed to provide the explanations that he has sought. If I may, with the limited time that I have, and I'm keen to get everything I have on the record, Mr. Chope, the standardised list does not allow for prisoners to have electric guitars in their possession. And this was something that the honourable member also referred to, particularly with reference to a letter that he had received. So the list does not actually allow for prisoners to have electric guitars in their possession. It was certainly not the case before the standardised list, facilities list came into effect, that prisons routinely allowed prisoners to have electric guitars in their possession. What has always been more usual is for prisoners to have access to electric guitars in a supervised setting. I know that the charities such as Jail Guitar Doors have donated a number of electric guitars to prisons over the past few years. Those guitars are most often kept in educational or chaplaincy departments for prisoners to use in a supervised environment rather than kept by individual prisoners. It is important to be clear that none of the changes we have made around IEP should have impacted on the use of electric guitars and other musical instruments in a supervised setting. The changes to IEP are around the property prisoners can possess in their cells. It is inevitable, Mr. Chope, when setting out the items that prisoners can have in possession, that there will be a variety of views on whether or not particular items should be allowed. We are clear, however, that the items we have included on the standardised facilities list provide a suitable range for governors to select from so that prisoners can be rewarded consistently and appropriately for engaging with the requirements of the IEP policy framework, and that, with appropriate access to musical instruments, the quality of their lives can be improved and their chances of successful rehabilitation will be enhanced. May I just conclude, Mr. Chope, by congratulating the honourable gentleman again for securing this debate, and I reiterate the assurance that I made at the outset that I will facilitate the meeting that he has requested with the Prisons Minister and indeed follow up with the outstanding information that has been referred to in this debate.